All right, you know structures. So here's the deal with structures. Everybody freaks out about structures because you got a bunch of calculations, you got all kinds of things that you're worried about, right? So imagine you walk up and there's a ditch and there's water in the ditch and you're standing there and you want to walk across and you have a board. You're going to put that board across the ditch and you're going to walk across it. Are you going to lay that board flat or are you going to have it be vertical in section? Well, the obvious advantage of laying it flat is I'm going to have a wider surface to walk on. But if I lay that board flat and that's a relatively long distance, it's going to buckle down, it's going to bow down. Now maybe it's strong enough and it won't break, or maybe it isn't, right? But if I put it vertically, it's going to be much, much stiffer, right? This is something you already know. This isn't anything radical, but this is how beams work, right? Where does the material want to be? Well, in this case, the big advantage we have is we're getting a bunch of material up at the top and down at the bottom. So in other words, we're getting material as far away from the neutral axis as we possibly can. So if we started looking at what an I, which is the moment of inertia, is, that's just a number that tells us if we start looking at all of the, wow, that was terrible, rectangle. If we start looking at, all right, this area is a certain distance from that neutral axis, and then this area is a certain distance, and then that area is a certain distance. So each of those have their own dimensions. And so we get the area times that dimension. So obviously we're getting essentially 0 out of the part because we're timesing it by 0. That's right at the neutral axis, but we're getting a much bigger number for these parts that are way out here at the edge. So the really key parts of our structural capacity here are as far away from that neutral axis as we can reasonably make it. So when we were looking at this board and trying to decide which way we were going to put it flat or we're going to put it upright, the realization is if we do it flat, we do that long, thin, flat thing, we have very little material far from the neutral axis, and then on the bottom we have, again, very little material far from the neutral axis. But in this one, we have a whole bunch of material far from the neutral axis, and it's farther from the neutral axis than this other one was. So we knew that if we laid it flat, it was going to bend a lot. We knew if we laid it upright, it was going to be much stiffer. We already knew that, and in fact, that's all that the moment of inertia is telling us, right? It's already stuff you know. The trick here is you have to start thinking about it in the language of engineers. So when you see a formula, when you see a term, don't just try to memorize the formula or memorize the term. Translate it back to your language, to an architect's language, right? I'm looking to make this stiff. I'm looking to make it not want to bend, right? Well, this is how we're thinking about that. We could look at through section modulus and a bunch of other ways of thinking about it, but those are just numbers ways of talking about things that we already know. Don't make it more complicated than you need. Another quick example. All right, here's our column, and that column is 12 inches tall by 4 feet in diameter. And I'm going to put a big weight on that column. Is that column going to buckle? Well, obviously not, right? This is concrete, let's say. There's no physical way that a column that stubby and that big could buckle. It just doesn't make any sense. It could crush, the concrete could fail, right? But it's not going to buckle. All right, let's try another column. Let's say I've got a column that is, how about 3 inches in diameter and it's 700 feet tall. I'm going to put a big load on that column. Am I going to crush the material there? Well, no, obviously not, right? I mean, there's no way there's no way I'd ever be able to load this thing in such a way that's 3 inches in diameter, 700 feet tall, where I would ever get to the point of crushing the material, because it's going to buckle way before that, right? It's going to it's going to bow way out before it does anything else. So we can tell right off the bat that this column, what the issue is going to be buckling. We can tell right off the bat that this column, what the issue is going to be whether the material is strong enough. So there's going to be a bunch of columns that fall into that category. There's going to be a bunch of columns that fall into that category. And then there's going to be these sort of unfortunate ones that you actually have to do both set of calculations to figure it out, right? Again, none of this is rocket science. Now, understanding when, the exact line that you start to apply this, or how the exact formula works, you just have to fit it into how you already would think about columns, right? All right, one last quick example. We just talked about deflection. I'm going to do, here's our delta. That's 5WL to the fourth, 384 EI. So when we have that beam and it starts to bend, let's say it's a beam with a brick wall above and it's over a set of a glass wall. So we're trying to make it, we don't crush the glass. We're worried about the deflection. And it's a relatively long beam. And what would make it deflect more? Well, the W is that distributed load. Oh, I'm just going to do that all the way across. So that's the W. So it's some number of pounds per linear foot. The L is the length. So that's the L. Well, what would make this deflect more? Well, we could increase the load. We could use a heavier brick, or we could use have more floors above, or whatever it happens to be. If we increased that W, if we made this load heavier, it's likely to bow more. And that delta is the difference. That's the deflection. So the delta goes up when the numerator goes up. Well, what else would make it deflect more? Well, we could make it longer. Maybe there's a column here, and instead of, we could get rid of this column and we could go even farther. So now our L's even bigger. Not only is it the L bigger, but we're doing it to the fourth. That would make a huge difference. So that would make it deflect more, right? Again, the numerator, the top part of the fraction, is going to go up. All right, well, what would make it deflect less? Well, we could make it shorter. So we could put another column in, sort of bring that L down. We could reduce the W, the weight that's above it. We could use a material, instead of saying maybe using wood, we could use steel. Well, that's going to make the E much, much bigger. So we're jumping the E, which is now in the denominator, which means that the bottom of the fraction is going to get bigger, which means the overall deflection, this overall delta number, is going to get smaller, which totally makes sense. We use steel, it's going to deflect less than if we were using wood. Or if the I, that thing we were just talking about, the moment of inertia, that thing that's about the shape, so the E is about the material, the I is about the shape, right? If we use a shape of our beam that is a better, stiffer shape, so maybe instead of it being like that, maybe we do something like that. So I'm getting more material farther from that neutral axis, right? So I'm getting a higher moment of inertia. So I'm increasing, again, the denominator. So I'm making the denominator bigger, therefore the delta is smaller. So this crazy looking formula that when you saw me write it out, you probably thought, what the heck is he doing? 5 over 384 WL to the fourth EI, like what is going on here? This is actually completely understandable, right? We make the thing longer, it's going to be harder to keep it from deflecting. We put more weight on it, it's going to be harder to keep it from deflecting. Put less weight on it, it's going to be easier. Make it shorter, it's going to be easier. We use a more robust material, it's going to be less. It's going to be less deflection, it's going to be more stiff. We use a better shape, it's going to be more stiff, less deflection. That's all this thing is saying. So this is all stuff that you already know. We're just talking about it in a way that engineers can get a number out of it. So don't panic about structures. It's more doable than you think.